You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Captain's log, stardate 41153.7. We're about to stop off at Farpoint station to take on new crew before we embark on our maiden voyage. Still, I get the impression my first officer doesn't trust me. He keeps giving me strange looks. In fact, he's doing it right now.
You know I can hear you, sir.
Oh, no one ever looks at Picard. What does he have, some special log cupboard or something? Report.
We've arrived at Farpoint station. Crew members awaiting transport.
Energize.
Cadet Alex Newsom reporting for duty. Permission to come aboard and be keen, sir.
Granted. I'm Captain Andrew Moyer. This is Commander James Kluski.
I wonder who wrote this script.
Commander, would you debrief the cadet?
I'm not sure that will be appropriate, sir.
Look, just give him the mission briefing.
Is that Pong?
Space Invaders. I've got the high score. Sorry. The first mission of the Galaxy-class starship USS Enterprise D is to explore the mystery surrounding the creation of the Farpoint station located on the planet Deneb 4. En route to Farpoint, Captain Picard and his crew first meet Q. The mysterious and powerful being denounces the human race as barbarians and challenges the crew of the Enterprise to disprove his belief. If Picard and his crew are not persuasive in their arguments, they will be sentenced to death.
Yeah, I think I got all that. Just one thing. Can I close this window? I mean, that noise is driving me mental.
Oh, I didn't know you could do that. Cyberspace, the new frontier. These are the voyages of the podcast First Contact. Its mission? To explore every episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. To seek out new viewers and have new conversations. To boldly view what many have viewed before. Hello and welcome to First Contact, a Star Trek The Next Generation Introcast. That means we are going to be watching every episode of Star Trek The Next Generation from the very start. Now, we are a couple of veterans, but hopefully we'll be seeing it through the eyes of our newcomer. I suppose we should explain our backgrounds in Star Trek. I was probably about 10 years old when I first watched Star Trek The Next Generation, and I was about the right age. I think it was probably season 4 I started watching. I have of course gone back and watched it all from the very start, but it's been a while, so I'm really looking forward to reacquainting myself over the duration of this podcast. James, how about you? What's your relationship with Star Trek?
Well, I started watching about 8 or 9 years ago. Mainly with Next Generation at first, but I slowly went into each other series, and now I think maybe controversially, I think Enterprise and Deep Space Nine are the best Star Trek series. But as my sort of first Star Trek series, I still hold Next Generation. It still has a warm place in my heart.
So that just leaves Alex. The reason this podcast is taking place at all. You're a science fiction fan. Many will find it bizarre that you've never watched Star Trek The Next Generation. So what's making you start watching now?
Well, when I was growing up, there was an awful lot of Star Trek on television, but it was all on at once, and it felt impenetrable at the young age I was at the time. And as such, you also didn't go and see the films. I never felt the need to go and see those at a young age. It was never high on my agenda. And by the time you reached Nemesis, I was only just in my teens, and I wouldn't have gone and seen it at that point either. It would have only come later. The films that obviously appealed to me more at that age were the Star Wars films, and you had the resurgence of that with the prequel trilogy coming out and the big hype around that. So that's what I latched onto rather than Star Trek. It's only been in recent time that it's something that I've then gone back to, because obviously it's so referenced in pop culture. You watch any animation, you watch The Simpsons, Family Guy, American Dad, any of those sort of things, they reference Star Trek all the time. Obviously we all do a Red Dwarf podcast, and there's a certain amount of referencing of Star Trek in Red Dwarf. So I decided to watch the J.J. Abrams film and quite enjoyed it, so I then decided to go back and watch the original cast films. So the next logical step seemed to be The Next Generation.
As you probably remember from our mission briefing, what seems like years ago now, we are talking about Encounter at Farpoint. Written by Gene Roddenberry and D.C. Fontana, directed by Corey Allen, and first screened September 26, 1987. We'll get into that in more depth in just a few moments, but Alex, what were your first impressions of the world of The Next Generation?
Well, I thought it was an interesting mix of the Star Trek that I'm used to from the first 6 films which I've seen and some of the original series, while also doing some different things. The one thing, and I might be entirely wrong here, is that I thought that Roddenberry's fingerprints were very much all over this. I don't know whether I'm right in saying that. I thought there were some very, very strong similarities between this and the first film.
Yeah, the first film sort of is based on Phase 2, and Next Generation is kind of based on Phase 2 as well. But definitely, creatively, in Season 1 of Next Generation, Gene Roddenberry has a much bigger influence. But as he has failing health through Season 2, 3 and 4, he has much less influence as it goes along.
Roddenberry was, of course, reduced to pretty much a consultant role on the movies following the creative, if not financial, failure of the motion picture. But here he's back in control. He's brought in writers from the original series. Actually, it was David Gerrold, the writer of The Trouble with Tribbles. He was responsible for the idea of having a counsellor on the bridge, having a Klingon officer on the bridge as well, and the first officer being the lead action man, as it were, and the captain staying on the bridge at all times. He wrote about that in a book in the 1970s called The World of Star Trek, and he was also responsible for the Bible for Star Trek Next Generation.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, there were certain things like Riker seemed to be very much a clone of is it Deckard in the first film?
Willard Deckard.
Yeah, there seemed to be a very strong parallel between those two.
Even in the names, and Ilea is Troy in many ways as well.
Yeah, I got that impression. Yeah.
So let's talk plot. There are 2 main plots competing for your attention in this episode. Firstly, the mystery of Farpoint Station, and then Q putting the human race on trial. Now, this was down to a battle between Roddenberry and the executives at Paramount. They wanted a feature-length opener, he wanted an hour-long one. Eventually, they won out, so the Farpoint plot was supplemented with this additional Q plot. And these 2 elements don't necessarily gel together. Did the Q plot stick out as something added?
Yes, very much so. I did wonder when I was watching it, and it was a point I was going to raise, whether it's 2 things combined. Because the other plot, the whole Farpoint plot, is very much a typical sci-fi trope, and I can't think of the earliest example of it, but it's been used. I suppose the most recent example I can think of is in Doctor Who and the Beast Below, of having the alien who's being abused by humanity, and everything is not as it seems, and it's all based around this alien creature who at the end is freed. That's a fairly standard plot, and that seems very sort of old school Trek to me, and sort of in line, I suppose, with things that you get in the movies, sort of somewhere between the first and the fourth film, I suppose. Whereas the Q plot was sort of crazy, and I don't think I really ever got a handle on what was going on.
What's to get at Q? He's an omnipotent being, and he's putting humanity on trial for all their sins, for some reason.
Was there any particular reason that of all of the guises he could take, he chose to almost permanently be dressed in a manner befitting Richard III?
They don't really deal with that particularly, or why they chose the courtroom of the late 21st century. They do seem to be rather arbitrary decisions, but I suppose it's trying to say, look where humanity's been, look at the bad they're capable of. But this show is all about how great humanity can be and the wonderful things that they can do.
I mean, there's an old adage that says that when your TV show puts a trial into the show, you know it's in trouble. It therefore seems odd to start a series with a trial element, but because it's so odd, that idea of trying the crew for the crimes of humanity for no particularly obvious reason, and touches in the courtroom scene of the final episode of The Prisoner, with that bizarre courtroom with all the interjections and things. It was very odd. It seems an odd way to start a series. I mean, on one hand, I guess you've got people pondering what on earth has just happened and will stick with it to try and find out. But it seems odd to start on something that's really never resolved and is largely forgotten through most of the story after the courtroom scene up until the very end.
To me, Q is the interesting part of this episode. You know, the Farpoint stuff is pretty, I wouldn't say boring, but...
Yeah, I'd go with that. The Q part really did grab my interest at the start, and I would have liked to have seen more of that, actually. I mean, that's not to say that I didn't enjoy the show as a whole, because I did very much. But yeah, I mean, there are two obviously different storylines that have been strapped together.
Well, I think with the Q storyline, it's quite good to, you know, be a bit confused about what's happening, because that's what Picard and the rest of the crew are feeling. You know, they don't know what's going on, so you're kind of there with the characters.
Did the writers, did they go into this knowing what Q was and why he was doing what he was doing? I mean, there seems to be a terrible tendency in American dramas to not plan these things out in advance.
I think I'd say they had an idea. They understood his motives, which was basically just to mess around with the crew.
I mean, I think if you see this episode as setting up potential avenues for a full series, then you can probably see Q as one of those. We'll put him there, and we're more than likely going to come back to him. It's an integral element, part of the show's DNA, if you will. But in contrast to that, we have the normality of Farpoint Station, not only in story terms, but also in terms of production design. We're told that this sets new standards for Federation space stations, but what we see of it doesn't really look that luxurious, in particular in comparison to the Enterprise itself.
Oh, horribly so. And I mean, if you watching it on Blu-ray as I was, it stands out even more. And in fact, I saw Encounter at Farpoint and the Man Trap sort of on the back of each other. And there's, at times, it's not far removed in terms of the planetary sets from one to the other. And maybe that's harsh, but you can tell that the money's really been spent on the Enterprise and not so much down on Farpoint. The marketplace, in particular, really does not hold up well. And then, at the end, with the model sequence and the explosions, that doesn't stand up particularly well, especially against the colour sky that you've got. It sort of highlights the fact that what you're looking at is a model and whatnot, which is a shame, actually, because I think the model work in the rest of the episode does stand up reasonably well. For something made at the time it still looks perfectly passable today, whereas many other shows doing a similar thing may well have produced work that wouldn't stand up in that manner.
And we will, of course, be discussing model work in future episodes. But back inside, we mentioned Q was maybe part of the DNA of the show. We also get to look at the holodeck, and there's a suggestion that'll be an avenue for possible stories. It does seem a little incongruous when there's an emergency going on that half your crew are messing about in a virtual forest.
Yeah, that whole scene on the holodeck, very much like the Bones scene, felt as if it could have been taken out without any great effect upon the rest of the story, aside from the little bits that we get with Data that are kind of nice character moments that we're starting to get a better understanding, and the relationship between Riker and Data. You know, that's the essential part for that scene. The actual showing off of the holodeck, again, like the separation of the ship, I got to be very much just another one of those things of, hey, look at what we can do now. It's much better than what you saw before. We've got something else. We can do this. We've got a room that, okay, technically it doesn't make any sense, and he's throwing a rock at the wall here and we can see the wall, but why has no one walked into the wall much earlier? How big is this room? But don't ignore those questions. We've got a room which has a forest.
They actually do have a kind of holodeck in the animated series, but it's not referred to as a holodeck, and they kind of indicate in this episode that the holodeck is a new thing.
And on the subject of the holodeck, how do you get wet from a holodeck?
Well, yeah, that's one of the things that viewers with hindsight will also look at confused.
Oh, right. Although you see these sort of things throughout, and you go, well, I don't quite get that, and those sort of things. You forgive an awful lot of it because it is the first episode, and I think that's only right to do so, as long as the whole is satisfying, and I think as a whole it does work. You know, it sets up a series with some interesting ideas and some interesting characters to develop well enough for you to want to come back again next week. And that's really all you can ask of an opening episode.
Shut off that damn noise.
Sorry, that sound effect can only mean one thing. It's time for our semi-regular look in depth at one particular aspect of the show. As this is our first week, it's a pretty good time to look at the crew. So, Captain Picard, what do we think of him so far?
He comes across as quite distant and quite stern. I mean, there's moments when that's broken, when he remembers his previous contact with the boy. But then, by the end of that scene, that's sort of gone out the window again, without having seen the show. The sort of general impression that I've always got is that he's a much less stern character than that. I'm guessing that's something that will be played down as the show goes on, in the same way that, say, in Doctor Who, when that show started, William Hartnell is has a very distant portrayal of the Doctor, and that's toned down as each story goes past.
I actually think they nailed down Picard quite well in the pilot. I thought that he was the character who was closest to, as he is, all the way up to season 7.
I thought they were very much trying to distance him from Shatner in that sort of that stern approach, trying to avoid any parallels being drawn right from the start.
I think that is a pretty good point. It's a very different kind of captain, as pointed out by Dr. Crusher. He's in the mould of a great explorer, distant and without family as well. But what do you think about some of his decision-making? Asking Riker, for example, to dock the battle bridge and saucer section without any computer guidance. Does that just make him seem like he's mental?
Before we get to that reminds me, that's another parallel I draw with the original film. The long drawn-out sequence of the two sections of the ship separating reminded me very much of the 6 minutes it took for Kirk and Bones to get onto the Enterprise in the original film.
I always think it's a bad sign when you have the time to play the entire opening titles music over a single special effects shot.
Yeah. I didn't get the sense particularly that his decision-making was at fault. And I mean, for a large share of the episode with the whole Q plot strand, you very much get the sense that no one knows what to do, and he's the only one who's really keeping calm enough.
I mean, it would be a pretty poor start to your first mission if you, totaled the Enterprise by not quite meeting up the two sections of it.
Yes, so why didn't they use any computer guidance?
Because he was testing Riker. He wanted to see if he was made of the right stuff.
Right, okay, I didn't get that the first time. Okay, in which case, yeah, that's a pretty mental decision, yeah.
Well, since we're on Riker, he's the first officer. What did you take away from him?
I took him to be very much the Deckard character, as I say. To draw a Doctor Who parallel again with the first series of that, he came across to me as sort of being like the character of Ian when Doctor Who started. You have Picard as the captain, and your figurehead for the show, whereas he's more sort of your go-to man for action, to have him go down onto the planet and be the lead in the action while you have Picard up on the ship.
Yeah, he's fulfilling the role that Kirk would ordinarily have taken.
And there's a hint of that in his name. He is William T. Riker, sharing that iconic middle initial with James T. Kirk.
Maybe it's because I've got hindsight, but Riker in the first season always seems very weird to me. And it might be just one small feature about him that makes him seem odd, but obviously I won't spoil that one small feature.
I mean, I didn't sort of get any deep character points from him. I sort of got that he was the likeable, approachable face for the show. Maybe sort of, as you say, taking on that sort of Kirk role, but I didn't get any sort of deep penetration of his character particularly.
Well, I think one of the criticisms has maybe been of early Next Generation is that characters don't really seem to have many secondary characteristics. They are pretty much one line as written on a page, which brings us quite nicely to Geordi LaForge. Now, he's blind. What else did you get?
That he struggles with his blindness and the pain of the blindness. That was pretty much it. If there was more to glean, I failed to do so.
I think Geordi LaForge, he just gets a ridiculously low amount of material in this episode. You know, as a main character, I still feel that, you know, you've got 2 minutes of the ship coming together, whereas we can't have a little bit more dialogue with Geordi.
Well, I don't think Worf got a particularly good deal there either. I mean, he didn't have a great deal to do, and for a fair amount, he's just left with the saucer.
Well, interesting you should say that. Worf wasn't actually intended to be a series regular. He was sort of a make-up extra, but his presence and the performance encouraged producers to make him a series regular from that point on. So you've definitely spotted perhaps the writer's intentions there.
Well, I think it's a canny move. It's interesting when you're having a show set much later than the films to have this idea that essentially the walls come down, so that you have, even if it's just one token Klingon, but you have a Klingon on board the Enterprise. I think that's an interesting development.
An interesting development, perhaps, but no real character depth there.
To be honest, one of the only ones that really you started to get something else with was Data, where they started to play with that idea of how you could have an android on the ship and the implications and whatnot. He's the one that I felt they were starting to go a bit deeper with. However, first episode, even as a feature-length episode, you forgive that to some degree because you're bringing in everyone, and there's so many characters. you're never going to be able to do that. That's the sort of thing that you would expect to come as the series goes on. So what is the precedent for androids in Star Trek at this point? I mean, is this another one of those sort of newer features, or...?
He's the only android in Starfleet of his kind. He's the most advanced android in the galaxy, and he's the only one that this is explained in a future episode, so I won't go too much into it, but his inventor made data, and he's the only one active, and there are other androids, but they're not advanced. Because, I mean, you see in the original series, there are androids, but they're very... I mean, Data is robotic, but the ones in the original series, unless they're trying to fool humans, then they're very robotic.
So, we've talked about the extra diversity in the Next Generation. We've now got Klingons on the bridge. Disability has been covered with Geordi. But we should also probably talk about the female characters. The original series, for all its pretensions of equality, the female characters did seem to be limited to Nurse or Uhura, essentially answering the phone on the bridge. But here we have Tasha Yar as head of security. But like many of the other characters, at this point, seemingly quite one note.
I suppose she's the headstrong character, the quick to jump into a fight. Not a great deal more beyond that, I'll grant you.
That brings us on to Chief Medical Officer Beverly Crusher. We know how important Bones was, but clearly they are going with something quite different here.
I think the only really important thing you get to know about Dr. Crusher is that she has this relationship with Picard.
Yes, she's very much, I would say, being inserted as the forbidden love interest, where you'll get a will they, won't they, perhaps, over the coming years, but, because they're in the military, they can't do anything about it.
Well, I thought it was a nice touch to have at least two characters who have a background. I mean, there's obviously more than just two. Yeah, setting you up with an idea that there's more than we know. I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to start off a series. Gains your attention, grabs your interest.
But Beverly did not come on board alone. She also has her teenage son, Wesley, and it's nice to have a family on board.
Is it nice to have a family?
Well, many families.
I mean, I don't know, but I would take a guess that many people found the boy very annoying.
Strange that you should say that. As many shows do, Doctor Who uses the companion as a sort of in for viewers. This is their eyes that you are seeing the show through. Now, Wesley Crusher, I think, is meant to play that role. He is the 15-year-old Star Trek fan. He's excited to be on board the Enterprise. I suppose a bit like Adric was in Doctor Who. Now, do you think that's a necessary character? Do you think with Star Trek we need an in like that? Or should they just get on with the adventure?
Interesting that you say Adric, because when I said that I imagine a lot of fans took against the character, it was for exactly the reason that Doctor Who fans took against Adric. That was exactly the parallel that I had in my mind. Do I think it's an essential character? I don't think the original series suffered for not having a character like that. I think in Doctor Who, the reason for having it is that your lead character isn't a human character. He is the great unknowable man. Whereas in Star Trek you have a series of characters that are human with human foibles for the most part. No, I don't think the inclusion of that kind of character is a necessity. However, I wouldn't say that you can't have that character. There's no reason that you can't have that type of character in there. I just don't feel that you can't continue without it.
And in many ways people look upon Wesley as Gene Roddenberry's presence on board the Enterprise, a bit like people look at Xander as Joss Whedon's in Buffy. Wesley being Gene Roddenberry's middle name.
Okay, fair enough. Well, and there was, as I've said before, there was certainly a presence of Roddenberry throughout the show. Right down to little things like when you see people walking past and you do a double take. Is that a man in a dress? Yeah. Yes, it is a man in a dress. Well, I mean, fair enough. It's just it's the only one I've seen. I think that's tokenism, but okay, fair enough.
You know, you'll see quite a lot of that throughout the first season.
Oh joy!
And every time you'll go, what?
It's not even as if it's a problem. It's just the fact that it seems out of place, and not because it's a man in a dress, because what's wrong with that, frankly? It's just the way that it's presented. And I get that's obviously a sort of Roddenberry ideal of, in the future, these things don't matter. And, yeah, fine. It's when you have just the one person in the background, I don't know. Maybe it was just because it caught me off guard. I don't know.
A man in a dress caught you off guard.
The dress itself, I feel quite uncomfortable every time I see Councillor Troy, who we've forgotten about, I wonder why. Every time she's sitting down on the bridge in that dress, you're quite aware she has to keep her legs very close together.
Yeah, for every bit of enlightenment, there's always something just at the background that makes you go, we aren't quite there yet though, are we?
I suppose in some ways that mini dress is a nod to the original series, but doesn't really seem particularly practical.
I don't really think it was a nod to the original. I think they actually wanted, it wasn't like an homage. It was literally, they thought, let's have her in a small dress because she'll look nice in it.
It was more of a nod and a wink and a nudge. Hey, say no more. Right.
Curiously enough, spoilers, this is the last episode that you're going to see Councillor Troy in an official Starfleet uniform for a significant period of time as she goes through various outfits, flaunting Starfleet regulations like there's no tomorrow.
Fair enough, and, well, where would the show be without the flouting of regulations?
Now, she's a counsellor, she's on the bridge, she's quite integral to the plot with her feeling and noticing things. Did you think that was something that worked for you within the plot of this?
Well, I'm glad that I wasn't the only one to have got the impression that she was there to turn around to people and say, for God's sake, feel something, man. I mean, you go through this show and you sort of draw parallels with the original series. So we're saying that Riker's sort of your Kirk replacement in a way, and obviously Data's the replacement for Spock. I could be wrong, but I got the sense that she's there taking some of the role of Bones, where you'd have that thing of, for God's sake, can't you feel something about this man? Does it work? I'd have to see more to be able to say. I suppose it worked best for me in the scene on the bridge with Picard. One thing I would just like to say though is that when we're talking about associations with Bones, I found the inclusion of Bones slightly odd. I mean, it was nice to see McCoy in there, but it was very brief and non-essential to the plot. I mean, it's obviously there as a handover thing, but yeah, one scene and then done with no real. It didn't feel as if it was going anywhere particularly.
I wonder if that was just inserted when it was changed to a 2-hour episode rather than a 1-hour episode, and they just needed to pad it out.
Well, actually, this was something that Gene Roddenberry wanted. He didn't think that DeForest Kelley would particularly want to be involved, but he did it actually for scale pay and was delighted. He wanted to pay back Gene Roddenberry for all the opportunities he had given him. But it is very brief, and it's one conversation with Data. You think maybe it might have had more resonance with the captain or with the entire crew in some kind of shared scene.
Well, I get the choice of Data in that, having said before that Data is clearly the replacement for Spock in a way, and obviously the relationship between McCoy and Spock is well known. So I sort of see that, and they make reference to that with you sure act like a Vulcan, but yeah. it's because it's so brief and fleeting. And yes, it would have been nice to see someone from the old crew have a handover to the new one in handing it over to Picard, maybe, rather than Data. You know, it's nice to have it, but I think I just would have liked to have seen maybe even just one scene more to feel that it was taking the plot somewhere rather than just being a perfunctory extra.
Yeah, and I think I would have preferred it, I know he is extremely old, if he wasn't buried under so much makeup, so he was more recognisably McCoy.
Yes, I know what you mean. It's a fairly heavy prosthetic, yeah.
I think one of the characters that we haven't gone over is actually the ship itself.
And there's very much a move in this first episode to show the ship as being bigger and better than before. I mean, obviously it's a new model, but the whole idea of having it separate out is... It seems very much to be saying, hey, you know what you've seen before? Well, look at this. It's going to be a few minutes more. It's going to be a few... I mean, look, it's separating. It's separating. It's still going. It's still going. And there it is. There it is. It's in two pieces.
Which I thought was a rather silly thing to do in the first episode. Surely you want to establish the ship as one whole, you know, so in the audience's mind, they understand the shape of the ship. But no, for half of the episodes, the ship is in two parts.
I'm guessing it's not an idea they come back to very much.
It's not. I think it's used...
Tellingly.
I think it's used about 3 or 4 times more.
I mean, it's not something I can imagine very many circumstances where you'd require it, to be honest. I mean, was I right that the idea was that by splitting it, you can have one half move faster?
The idea, as far as I understand it, is that the Enterprise is a ship that's got families on it, so you put all the non-essential crew in and they're all safe in the saucer section, and then the rest of the ship goes into battle. So anytime there's a dangerous situation, you just leave the ship defenseless on its own in the middle of space and go and fight with your warp drive. Doesn't seem overly practical.
Okay. Is that the section of the ship that's best equipped for that?
Probably not. We will be looking at the Enterprise in a bit more depth in a future episode, but that about wraps it up for this time. If you would like to leave a comment, then you can do so on the blog post at thespoilist.com/podcast. You can get in touch by emailing us at firstcontact@thespoilist.com, and of course we would be delighted if you would subscribe on iTunes. Next time we will be looking at The Naked Now.
And I understand that we'll all be performing that show naked.
Yes, and you can be very glad that this is not a video cast. Hopefully you've enjoyed this first podcast. I'm sure most will be much more interesting. For now, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Please leave us a review.
If you don't leave us a review, then...
I'm going to come round your house and I'm going to bring some pliers and some bungee rope.
I'm going to come round your house and touch your comm badge.